Well, hi there. This is a fennec fox. It is the smallest member of the family Canidae with bones, or that reproduces sexually. Though it is actually rather far from being the smallest canid alive today, it is a true fox, which not all foxes are. And I want to take you on a tour of every single extant canid species, including the parasitic invertebrate species that does terrible things to the nether regions of other canids. So, let's get going. So all modern canids fall into the subfamily Caninae, which is a proper clade, as are the now extinct bone-crushing dogs of the subfamily Borophaginae. The rest of the canids have all been tossed into a single paraphyletic garbage bin of a subfamily called Hesperocyaninae. But from a phylogenetic standpoint, it is garbage, as both other subfamilies are nested within it. Canids, as is the case with all caniform carnivorans, are an ancestrally North American lineage, but they have since infiltrated every continent except for Antarctica, though they only made it to Australia with human assistance. We already have a video about all of the caniform carnivorans if you want to know more about them. The subfamily Caninae first appeared in North America about 35 million years ago, only leaving within the last 7 to 8 million years. And let's start with the two species of foxes that are only foxes if literally all extant canids are foxes. Those would be the two species in the genus Urocyon, which have to be two of the prettiest of all canids. The gray fox and the island fox. They are the basalmost of all extant canids. Literally, all other canids are more closely related to one another than they are to these two. Which is why, unless these are the only true foxes, if they are foxes, then literally all canids are foxes. Or fox doesn't mean much of anything except for small canid. These guys are so cool looking. I really think that the island fox might be my new favorite canid. It'll be interesting to see if that lasts as we dig deeper into this group. If you've seen one of these two species before, it was probably the gray fox, Urocyon cineroargenteus. These guys are found in most of North America south of the southernmost parts of Canada, in Central America, and northern South America. It is the only canid found in both North and South America. They're a pretty small canid, generally coming in between 3.6 and 7 kilos, or 7.9 to 15.4 pounds when fully grown. But they're particularly well suited to tree climbing, which allows them to thrive in wooded areas even when larger canids are present there. Being the most distantly related of all canids, it's pretty easy to distinguish them from others if you know what to look for. They tend to have a white belly and a salt and pepper back with hints of red in between, especially on their conspicuously thick necks. They have a black stripe down the tail, ending in a black tip to the tail. They also tend to have black on the sides of the muzzle. That salt and pepper back and stripe on the tail are the biggest and most conspicuous indicators that this is what you have. Though if you're in the Channel Islands off the coast of California and you see what looks like a tiny gray fox running around, you might have found my current favorite canid, and the closest relative of the gray fox, the island fox, Urocyon littoralis. And these guys are little, like 1 to 2.8 kilos little. That's 2.2 to 6.2 pounds. Little. The smallest sexually reproducing canid in North America, because of insular dwarfism, which we discussed in great detail just a couple of months ago in this video, which is the most viral video we've ever released. Yet it still has a better than 99 to 1 like to dislike ratio. So you might want to check that one out next. But not yet! Not only are the Channel Island foxes quite distinct from mainland gray foxes, but each island has its own subspecies, and they differ not only in size from one another, largely based on the size of the island on which they reside, but they even differ in other ways, like the number of tail vertebrae that they have. I love them. All of the other canids are more closely related to one another than they are to these two glorious little false foxes. And they fall into two large clades, one of which being the Vulpini, which contains the 15 canids that are either definitely foxes or that could be included with the foxes without calling wolves foxes. 12 of them fall into the fox genus, Vulpes. If you know one fox, one true fox, it would probably be the red fox, Vulpes vulpes. In fact, it is probably the canid that you are most likely to have actually seen in your life other than the domestic dog. They live across most of North America, pretty much all of Europe and Asia, and well into Northern Africa. And they're introduced into Australia, just in case you didn't have enough places where you can see them. This is a species that actually originated in Eurasia and made its way back to the birthplace of its ancestors in North America, as well as most of the rest of the Northern Hemisphere. They're doing well. Having such a large range, they can vary quite a bit in appearance. They range in size from 2.2 to 14 kilos, about 5 to 31 pounds. That's a pretty big range. But most are red with long, fluffy tails and long snouts, often having some white on their chest, belly, and muzzle. Having 11 other members of their genus, I'll just go through them in alphabetical order by species name. So this is the Bengal fox, Vulpes bengalensis, also called the Indian fox. It is found, rather unshockingly, in and around India. And you would never confuse it for a red fox. Honestly, it looks more like a gray fox. But this one actually is a fox. It has a similar kind of salt and pepper dorsal with a more rufous underneath and with a black tail tip and dark sides to the muzzle. It doesn't have the red collar or the black stripe on the tail of the gray fox, and it lives far from the range of the gray fox, but it is a similar look. It makes me wonder if this is the ancestral coloration of the whole subfamily. And they're small, actually a little bit smaller than gray foxes on average, generally somewhere between 2.3 and a touch over 4 kilos, or about 5 to 9 pounds. So about the same size as the smallest of the red foxes. If you go a little more east in Asia, you will run into the range of the Blandford's fox, Vulpes cana, which also seems to exist in patches of the Arabian Peninsula. This is a tiny little fox, arguably the second smallest of all canids, weighing, at least as we've measured them, less than a kilo on average, but with huge ears and a tail about as long as the rest of the fox. They're kind of a brownish gray in color with a more yellowish underside. They have a dark stripe down their back and generally a dark tail tip, and black stripes under their eyes like a cheetah. You certainly wouldn't confuse them with a Bengal fox or a red fox. But a fox that you might confuse with a Bengal fox would be this one, the Cape fox, Vulpes cama. For one thing, they're just a tiny bit larger, at 2.5 to 4.5 kilos, just 5.5 to just under 10 pounds, which is, for all intents and purposes, the same size. Colored a lot like a jackal, with a salt and pepper dorsal and a more rufous underbelly, which is also similar to the Bengal fox, with a black tail tip and dark patches on the muzzle. Overall, though, they look even more like a gray fox than they do like Bengal foxes, with the red on their neck. But they live in southern Africa, so there's little reason to confuse them with Bengal foxes or their most distant canid relative, the gray fox. Moving back to Asia, but higher in latitude, you will find one of the most remarkable looking of all canids, the Corsac fox, Vulpes corsac. It's hard to describe what makes these foxes so striking, but it definitely has something to do with the intensity of their eyes. It's a smaller fox, 1.6 to 3.2 kilograms, like 3.5 to just over 7 pounds, but looks nothing like the other small foxes we've seen so far. If anything, it looks like a red fox, but with generally yellowish fur that gets lighter on the bottom and with very light patches on the chest and chin. And if you like the look of the Corsac fox, then going just a bit south, you will run into a fox that has taken this look even further. This is the Tibetan fox, Vulpes ferulata, also called the Tibetan sand fox. This is the most carnivorous of all foxes, which tend to be more omnivorous, specializing on high-altitude rodents and lagomorphs. But they're still not that large, 4 to 5.5 kilos, just under 9 to just over 12 pounds. They're mostly gray, tan, and rufous in color. Nothing really too special about their coloring. But that base is one of the most unique of any canid. If there's one fox that's likely to be on your list of favorite canids, it's probably this one, the Arctic fox, Vulpes legopus. Found on land all over the Arctic, this has to be one of the most special animals on the planet. If you don't love them, you're either a lemming or you hate animals. Though they only look like this in the winter. In the summer, they look more like this. And about 1% of them have a dominant allele that prevents them from turning white in the winter. So if you see a dark, fluffy fox in the Arctic in the winter with short ears and a short muzzle, well, it's still probably an Arctic fox. Just the rare blue morph. And again, that morph is dominant. People often assume that dominant alleles should be more common. But the truth is that just because they're expressed fully in a heterozygote, that doesn't mean that they will be more common. In fact, it's easier to purge a dominant allele from a population than a recessive allele, as it cannot hide. Selection is always acting on dominant alleles. Selection can only act on recessive alleles in homozygous individuals. I should probably make a whole video about this sooner or later. The reality is that I should probably make a whole video about just Arctic foxes, and that would be as good a time as any to discuss this in more detail. But we have a lot of canids still to cover. So I'll just talk a little bit more about Arctic foxes. Arctic foxes are pretty variable in size, between 1.4 and 9.4 kilos, or just over 3 to nearly 21 pounds, with males, as is often the case with foxes, being larger than females. Man, I'm really excited to make a whole video about these. But if what you really want is a true fox that you could mix up with the most distant canid relative of all foxes, then the kit fox, Vulpes macrotus, is probably your fox. For starters, it looks like a gray fox. They have the salt and pepper back, white belly, and the red in between, even up on the neck. They have the black on the muzzle, the black tail tip, and they're found within the range of the gray fox. They both have big ears in southwestern North America, though they're more similar in size to island foxes at between 1.6 and 2.7 kilos, 3.5 to like 6 pounds. But they don't have the black stripe down the tail. So that is probably the best way to tell them apart from gray or island foxes, which again, are not foxes, because not all foxes are foxes. But kit foxes are foxes, as is this, the pale fox, Vulpes pallida of Central Africa, which is a fox that you are unlikely to have ever seen and that you are unlikely to mix up with any of the other foxes or things called foxes that we've discussed so far. This is like a weasel of a fox, short in stature but long in body, sandy in coloration with a white belly, a black tipped tail, and striking dark eyes. They blend in quite well in their desert habitat, and do have the large ears typical of desert foxes, other than Rommel, who had rather small ears for a human. Interesting shape to them, though. Pale foxes are one of the least studied of foxes, mostly because they live at the edge of the Sahara Desert, where not too many researchers want to spend time looking for rad little foxes. But if you're ever at the edge of the African desert and you see a fox that fits this description between 2 and 3.6 kilos, or 4.4 to about 8 pounds, running around, you'll be on a short list of people who have ever seen one in the wild. If you're ever farther north than Africa or in the Middle East and you see a fox kind of similar to this description, it's likely a Rupel's fox, Vulpes rupelii, though these seem to be more closely related to red foxes. In fact, there is some evidence that they're just a desert variety of red fox. But they're little, averaging just 1.7 kilos, about 3.7 pounds, with the big ears and sandy-colored coat that you would expect of a canid desert fox. They have much more variation in color on their face than do pale foxes, with reds and blacks. And their eyes are not the black color that you see in pale foxes. They seem to generally have a white-tipped tail, not black. And being from an even more extreme part of the desert, their ears are larger still than those of pale foxes. Large ears play an important role in thermoregulation, so the hotter the area, likely the larger the ears. There is another fox that can be mistaken for a Rupel's fox, but we'll have to wait a couple of foxes before we get to them. But it is the smallest of all non-parasitic canids, plus it looks like a baby Rupel's fox, so you'll know it when we get to it. But first, let's go back to North America, specifically to the center of North America, and discuss this, the swift fox, Vulpes velix. It is the closest relative of the kit fox that we discussed earlier, And some biologists consider them to be the same species, but that seems to be a minority opinion. Unsurprisingly, they have a very similar coloration to kit foxes, with kind of a washed out gray fox coloration minus the tail stripe. From about 2.3 to 3.2 kilos, or 5 to 7 pounds, so just a touch larger than a kit fox. The best way to tell them apart is probably by knowing which side of the Rocky Mountains you're on. East, swift fox. West, kit. Stripe, not a fox at all. Okay, so that gets us to the last unambiguous fox. The fennec fox. Vulpes zerda. The smallest canid with males and females, despite being most closely related to the Blandford's fox of Asia. These guys are found in the deserts of northern Africa, so are more likely to be mistaken for pale foxes and especially Reptiles foxes. As you would expect, being a canid desert fox, they have a sandy coloration and big ears. They have, in fact, the biggest ears for their body size of any canid, which really doesn't mean that they have huge ears. It has more to do with the fact that they have tiny bodies. They only weigh about a kilo at most, about 2.2 pounds, which is a good-sized bunch of grapes, but it's a pretty dang small canid. They have much smaller muzzles, even for their size, than their two larger doppelgangers, and generally cream-colored faces with reddish cheetah eye stripes, which is very different from pale foxes. Their black tail tip will set them apart clearly from the Reptiles fox. And so that gets us through all of the things that are unambiguously foxes, but not everything that justifiably could be considered foxes. At least without making every canid a fox or making fox a phylogenetically irrelevant term. And one of the things that could be considered foxes are called foxes. But the problem is that the closest relatives of the unambiguous foxes of the genus Vulpes are these. The two species of raccoon dogs of the genus Nycterudes, which are not raccoons, nor are they dogs per se, but they are canids. And if anything but Vulpes are foxes, then they have to be foxes. But I have never heard anyone, anywhere, call them foxes. Originating in China about 5.5 million years ago, it was one of the first canid groups outside of North America, and was at one time a fairly diverse clade, though only 2 species seem to have existed in the last many thousands of years. Those species being the common raccoon dog, Nycterudes procyaenoides, and the Japanese raccoon dog, Nycterudes vivarinus. And don't worry, at the rate that they have been deliberately introduced to other places on Earth, the future looks bright for raccoon dogs once again, diversifying all over Asia and Europe. Japanese raccoon dogs are endemic to Japan. Common raccoon dogs are native to the eastern part of mainland Asia, though they exist in many other places now. Both species have a roughly raccoon-colored back, kind of brown and black, with black on their bellies, though the belly is much more black in the common raccoon dog. They have small ears and black raccoon masks. Honestly, they are clearly carnivorans, and pretty clearly caniform carnivorans. But it would be easy to see them as not only not foxes, but as not even being canids. Good thing we have morphological, fossil, nuclear, and mitochondrial evidence to help us figure things like this out. They are much more omnivorous than are most canids, and have much longer intestines as well as other adaptations such as modified teeth. It has actually occurred to me fairly recently that being able to eat plants as a major source of sustenance is actually the exception, not the rule. Basically, everything can eat other animals, but eating plants is hard. Lineages that excel at it tend to thrive, as plants are easy to catch, but it's hard to get much out of them, so most lineages don't seem to pull it off. Well, these guys are well on their way. Common raccoon dogs range in size from 3 kilos, about 6.6 pounds, to as much as 10 kilos, 22 pounds. And it seems to have more to do with time of year than variation between individuals or sexes. Japanese raccoon dogs, also known as tanuki, are somewhat smaller, though that too probably depends on the time of year. But if you're in Japan and you see a raccoon dog, it's almost certainly a tanuki. Anywhere else, like in much of Europe, it's probably a common raccoon dog, which is definitely a canid. But is it a fox? Well, this is the bat-eared fox, Autoscion megalotus, the only member of the genus Autoscion, and the closest relative to the unambiguous foxes, except for the raccoon dogs. Found in South and Eastern Africa, honestly, they have a somewhat raccoon dog-like coloration, but a very un-raccoon dog shape. They are tall, lightly built, with long legs, short faces, and giant ears. And it too has a unique diet, almost purely insects, which further plays into its similarity to bats. Though to my knowledge, the ears are still for thermoregulation and not for echolocation. They weigh between 3 and 5.3 kilos, 6.6 to about 11.7 pounds. And while they don't look like other non-desert foxes, they do look reasonably like foxes that eat like bats. But are they foxes? Obviously, if red foxes and gray foxes are foxes, then they're foxes. But if fox refers to a monophyletic group, even if that group doesn't include things like wolves, bush dogs, and bulldogs, well, raccoon dogs would still have to be foxes. So are raccoon dogs foxes? Because if they're not, then a whole lot of other foxes aren't going to be foxes either. Because we aren't even halfway through the canids just yet, and we have a lot of foxes left to go. Plus one possible fox that hasn't got any bones. Within the Canidae, there are two large clades. The Vulpini, the fox-like canines that we just discussed, and the Canini, the dog-like canines. Everything we are yet to discuss. Now don't get me wrong, the Canini is still full of things called foxes. Because not all foxes are foxes. But it is, I guess with the exception of the raccoon dogs, which arguably are foxes, the only clade that includes things that look very distinct from foxes. Because raccoon dogs might be foxes and certainly aren't dogs. Unless all foxes are dogs. And this creature, the Darwin's fox, might be a dog and certainly isn't a fox. Unless all dogs are foxes. Now this dog-like clade itself contains two clades. The South American clade, Cerdocyanina, and the wolf-like clade, Canina, which doesn't include all of the things called wolves, but it does include everything that I think reasonably can be considered a wolf, at least from a phylogenetic perspective. So if wolf has anything to do with descending from wolves, and not just being a large canid of any ancestry, then it contains all of the wolves, including some that might surprise you. There are some familiar wolves that you might not realize are wolves, and some wolves that are obligate parasites of other wolves. And it doesn't include anything commonly called a fox, at least exclusively called a fox. So let's start with this foxless, sometimes boneless clade, as I think we've waited long enough to talk about them. And I'll start by mentioning that the dire wolf, not these, but the actual dire wolf, is the outgroup to this entire clade. So if they are wolves, and gray wolves are wolves, then from a phylogenetic standpoint, everything in this clade are wolves. And if you were going to try to resurrect a dire wolf in the way that we discussed in this video, then starting with the genome of any member of this clade would be just as legitimate as starting with a gray wolf genome. They are all equally related to dire wolves. But among these animals that are arguably wolves, the extant lineage most distantly related to the rest are the two species of true jackals. I specify because not all jackals are jackals either. But these two are. They are the two members of the genus Lupulella, the black-backed jackal and the side-striped jackal, which are somewhat confusing names as neither of them really have black backs. Both have kind of salt and pepper backs, and both have stripes on their sides. Though I would say that the black stripe on the side of not the side-striped, but the black-backed jackal is by far the more conspicuous and consistently present side stripe. But if the side stripe is faded or has any hint of white, then it's probably a side-striped jackal. The good news is that they do not have a ton of overlap in their ranges. Though the wolf-like canines are a historically North American clade, they have spread far outside of North America. Jackals are native to Africa, with black-backed jackals being present in southern and eastern Africa, and the side-striped jackals being present in sub-Saharan Africa pretty much everywhere else. Black-backed jackals weigh between 6 and 13 kilos, around 13 to 29 pounds, and are generally reddish in color below the black stripe and salt and pepper above. The side-striped jackal is a tiny bit larger, 6.5 to 14 kilos, or about 14 to 31 pounds. They tend to be less red and more gray below the white side stripe, with a similarly colored back. And both are pretty opportunistic feeders on basically whatever they can get, from plants to insects to antelope and everything in between. Heck, some feed primarily on seals and penguins, which might explain how some of their relatives ended up back in the sea, getting eaten by jackals. Now, I mentioned that jackals are African, but we're going to find that they're not the only African lineage. And in fact, we're going to notice a very interesting pattern indeed with regards to Africa and the wolf-like canines. Because the next most distantly related species to all the rest is also from Africa. The painted or African wild dogs. And just to be clear, African wild dogs are more closely related to all of the other wolf-like canids than they are to the two species of jackals. Which would lead me to suspect that while the clade may have originated in North America, which is something we know from paleontological and genetic evidence derived from extinct members of the clade, all of the modern wolf-like canids may be the descendants of a single African lineage. But we can keep examining this hypothesis as we dig deeper into the group. But for now, let's talk about African wild dogs. Unlike jackals, these guys are hypercarnivorous. They eat almost exclusively meat. They're also the largest canids in Africa at 18 to 36 kilos, 40 to 79 pounds. Some of you may be thinking that hyenas are larger, and you're correct, but they're not even closely related to dogs at all. They're more closely related to lions. And you can watch this video next if you want to know more about that. And lions are one of their major competitors. African wild dogs are persistence hunters that chase ungulates, forcing them to run until they overheat or become otherwise exhausted. A hunting strategy that may have played a role in Homo sapiens becoming the dominant and indeed only human species on the planet. African wild dogs are also called painted dogs for reasons that make a lot of sense. Their coarse coats are asymmetrical in pattern and individually unique, but usually are made up of a combination of black, white, and kind of a reddish brown. A very calico cat type coloration. They have relatively large ears and generally a dark stripe on their foreheads. They're found in small isolated populations across sub-Saharan Africa. So again, among extant wolf-like canids, the first two lineages to branch off are at least currently found in Africa. The next species to break off from the rest after these two African lineages is not from Africa, but they aren't from North America either. They're from Asia. And that would be the dhole, which is one of the 10 animals that I didn't know existed a few months ago. A fact that has surprised many a fan of the Jungle Book. But don't worry, I know about them now, and they're rad. They're a very interesting looking canid. Relatively large, between 10 and 21 kilos, 22 to 46 pounds, with males being larger than females. They're mostly red, often with a white throat and chest. A very red fox type coloration, but generally with a dark tail. They have large heads but rather short muzzles with subsequently fewer molars than most canids. And they have a very long, rather flexible spine. Unlike painted dogs, these guys are extremely omnivorous, though they do hunt larger ungulates as well as smaller prey. Basically, if something in their environment can be eaten by something smaller than a tiger, they probably eat it. Though they're found today mostly just in South Central Asia, their ancestral range was much larger, extending into Europe and possibly Northern Africa and North America. But that seems to still be in doubt. But what this means is that the three basalmost lineages of this clade are found in Africa, and Eurasia, very much supporting the idea of an old world origin to this extant lineage of an admittedly North American clade. The next lineage to diversify from this clade were the false jackals, or as they're often called, golden jackals, which at least are closer to being jackals than golden moles are to being moles. I mean, golden moles are more closely related to manatees than they are to moles. At least golden jackals are among the closest living relatives of actual jackals. But the gold standard seems to be that they aren't what we call them. Golden jackals are found across southern Europe and Asia today, which only further supports our old world origin hypothesis. Not only are golden jackals not that closely related to jackals, they really don't look that much like them either. They look more like their closest relatives, coyotes and other wolves. And yes, I did just call coyotes wolves. While all of this clade is wolf-like, as long as we don't consider extinct animals like dire wolves to be true wolves, then not all of them are necessarily wolves. But basically all of the closest relatives of golden jackals are called wolves and form a monophyletic group. So I have absolutely no problem calling all of them wolves, just as long as you're okay with calling literally all of them wolves. I'm even okay calling golden jackals wolves. They are the hagfish of wolves, and are even part of the wolf genus, Canis. It is much easier to make a case for them being golden wolves than golden jackals. But other than having a coloration that is sometimes reminiscent of jackals, they really look much more like wolves, but smaller, somewhere between 6 and 14 kilos, or 13 to 31 pounds. They're overall smaller and more lightly built, with a proportionally long spine, much like dholes, with a skull similar in size and shape to that of one of the closest relatives of the boneless parasite dogs, the dingo. And they're basically the Eurasian equivalent of a coyote. Whereas dholes form large packs, these guys are much less social, though they do form monogamous pair bonds for life. And they're not highly territorial. They often tolerate other pairs overlapping their territory for extended periods and will abdicate their territories as soon as wolves move in. They are opportunistic omnivores that both hunt and scavenge. And that gets us to the wolves, or the rest of the wolves, if we consider the golden jackal to be a wolf, including the wolf that reproduces asexually and doesn't have a nose. After the golden jackal, the wolf least closely related to the rest is this one, the Ethiopian wolf, which is, unsurprisingly, if you know where Ethiopia is, from Africa. Ethiopia specifically. I have no problem calling them Ethiopian wolves, even if you don't want to consider golden jackals to be wolves. But I'll give you some other common names for Ethiopian wolves. I'll go from least upsetting to most upsetting, and they're all pretty upsetting. Red jackal. Only true if all of the wolf-like canids are jackals, but just as legitimate as calling golden jackals jackals. And these are pretty red, usually with white on their nose and chest and dark tails. Some pretty dull-like colors. Simian jackal. Simian being part of Ethiopia where a Jewish kingdom once resided. And they do live in the Simian Mountains, but not exclusively in the Simian Mountains. They're actually found in 7 different mountain ranges in Ethiopia, all at altitudes between 3,000 and 4,500 meters. So though some are simian, they aren't all simian, and again, they're only jackals if all wolf-like canids are jackals. Horse jackal. This one really seemed odd, though I did find a good explanation for it. Ethiopian wolves are generally highly specialized feeders on high-altitude rodents, like African mole rats. But apparently, there's at least one other food that they enjoy. Because horse jackal is apparently a direct translation of the Oromo name for them. A name given to them because they often follow livestock, including horses, that are about to give birth, so they can enjoy some yummy placenta once, they're all done with it. So on its face, horse jackal is a very upsetting name. But in the end, it kind of makes sense. Especially if all wolves are jackals. Which is starting to be the way that I am seeing this. But there is a name that is clearly the worst. Simian, which, again, is not the only place where these reside. Fox, which is only true if all jackals, and indeed all extant canids, are foxes. But they do have a narrow face and a very red fox-like coloration, so I get it. It's super wrong phylogenetically, but I get it. And in the future, we're gonna see an animal that looks a ton like a giant stilted South American fox that isn't closely related to wolves at all, but is called a wolf. And it isn't even arguably a jackal, let alone a wolf. So it could be worse. Ethiopian wolves are the rarest canids in Africa. They're also reasonably large, coming in between a little over 11 to a touch over 19 kilos, or about 25 to 43 pounds, with males being larger than females, as is the case pretty much across the genus Canis. So that brings us to 3 African lineages and 2 Eurasian lineages, and none from North America. Well, if I told you that the next lineage to break off from the rest of the wolf-like canids is an animal called the African wolf, where would you guess that it comes from? Well, if you said Africa, you'd be right. In fact, they're from most of the northern half of the continent, having such a wide range that they have a number of subspecies and common names. And while most of them include the word wolf, you shouldn't be surprised at all by now to find out that names like wolf jackal, jackal wolf, African golden jackal, North African jackal, gray jackal, Egyptian jackal, and most insultingly of all, African jackal? I mean, what about all the other jackals from Africa? Where are they supposed to go? Anyway, I think that I'm convinced that all wolves are jackals. Wolf-like canids are jackals, at least the modern ones, and some jackals are wolves. And arguably all of them are foxes, but we'll settle that in the future. For a long time, African wolves were thought to be closely related to golden jackals. But molecular analysis has since revealed that they're more closely related to gray wolves, coyotes, and the wolves without legs than they are to golden jackals. They're smaller than Ethiopian wolves, but larger than striped or black-backed jackals, coming in at around 7 to 15 kilos, which is about 15 to 33 pounds. Interestingly, at least for this genus, without significant difference between the males and the females. Though their exact coloration varies across their range, they generally have reddish legs and a salt and pepper back and sides, with no sort of striping, often with white on their throat and chest. They have relatively large ears and a long but somewhat narrow snout. Like many of the wolf-like canids, they are omnivorous. And these guys hunt mostly small prey, but sometimes catch somewhat larger animals like gazelles and even warthogs. So in all, of the 6 basal-most lineages of wolf-like canids, 4 are from Africa and 2 are from Eurasia, which very much supports our hypothesis that wolf-like canids, though they first evolved in the Americas, all of the extant lineages seem to have descended from a single lineage of wolf-like canids, let's call them jackals, that had emigrated from North America to likely Africa, not directly, with a couple of lineages successfully colonizing Eurasia. With just a single lineage, this last lineage that we have to discuss, recolonizing North America, and possibly playing a role in driving their distant North American relatives to extinction. Because there was a time when dire wolves and gray wolves coexisted in North America, and now they don't. So let's dive into this final lineage of wolf-like canids, the lineage that appears to have recolonized the ancestral homeland of the wolf-like canids, and then, at least in one case, went blind and lost its teeth and brain. In fact, let's start there. Because at this point, the remaining wolf-like canids split into 2 small groups, one containing 2 species and the other 3. This 2-species clade contains the gray wolf and the domesticated wolf, more often known as the domestic dog. Domesticated dogs are the descendants of what probably would have been classified as gray wolves. However, they appear to be all that remains of that specific gray wolf lineage. And since all extant gray wolves are more closely related to one another than any of them are to the lineage that produced domestic dogs are basically the hagfish of gray wolves. For this reason, sometimes they're classified as a subspecies of gray wolf, and sometimes they're classified as a unique species closely related to gray wolves. But they are a great example of what can happen to a population over time if the strength of selection for specific traits is sufficiently high. Because while some species look a lot like gray wolves, many look absolutely nothing like gray wolves, or even like many other breeds of domestic dogs. Domestic dogs are found today basically everywhere humans are found, sometimes even returning to the wild, such as the dingo and the New Guinea singing dog. And while I say everywhere humans are found, I mean, we sent them into space. Generally, they range in size from a bit over half a kilo, about 1.22 pounds, to slightly over 90 kilos, about 200 pounds. But that is speaking specifically about dogs with bones, because some dogs can be even smaller and live on the genitals of other dogs. This is a canine transmissible venereal tumor, CTVT, a contagious tumor transmitted between canids during mating. One of only 3 known contagious cancers in mammals today, with one that impacts the faces of Tasmanian devils, called devil facial tumor disease, and one that impacts Syrian hamsters, called contagious reticulum cell sarcoma. But the fact that they are contagious cancers is not really the weirdest thing about them. Usually, if an animal gets cancer, it's basically being attacked by its own cells. A mutation has generally occurred that causes certain cells to begin copying themselves excessively, resulting in masses that often interfere with other key bodily functions. That's what makes cancer so difficult to treat. For most diseases, you attack it with something that would kill it, that wouldn't kill you. The problem with cancer is that it is you. Usually. But that is not the case with CTVT. This is a cancerous tumor, but it isn't composed of the cells of the infected canine. Oh no. It has its own genome, and that genome is that of a dog. An individual dog. Specifically, a Native American dog with a little coyote DNA mixed in there. A hybrid, but a hybrid that was mostly domestic dog. Which means that dogs like the dog that almost killed me, an Alaskan Malamute, are more closely related to these asexually reproducing genital tumors than it is to, say, a German Shepherd. Because you can't evolve out of a clade, CTVT is just as much a dog, a wolf, a jackal, and possibly a fox as is any other domestic dog. But it lives as an often single-celled, parasitic, brainless, boneless, asexually reproducing tumor on the genitals of its more conventional cousins. It now appears that it diverged from its boned-brained, sexually reproducing cousins more than 6,000 years ago. By some estimates, around 11,000 years ago. And today, by almost any species concept, it could and probably should be classified as its own species. Again, nested within Canis familiaris. Because classification is often messy, this would make the rest of Canis familiaris subsequently paraphyletic. And then this group would be Canis, Congeries genitalium, which is Latin for cluster on the genitals. Maybe Canis exosatus, Latin for boneless. It better be something like that. But it truly is a dog without bones. Though given that most dogs have a baculum, it does often live in close proximity to dog bones. The closest relatives of these most bizarre of all canids, other than the other domestic dogs, are the gray wolves of Eurasia and North America, which again may include domestic dogs as a subspecies. But modern gray wolves appear to form a monophyletic group without including any penis tumors in it. And honestly, if you can make an argument for kicking a genital parasite out of your species, I say do it. So when I refer to gray wolves, know that I am talking about the smallest clade that includes all extant gray wolves, even though the species may be larger than that. What's a species anyway? This is the largest of all extant canids, coming in between 12 and almost 80 kilos, or 26 to 175 pounds, with males slightly larger than females. Some dog breeds do get larger, but as a species, these are the largest. Certainly the largest wild species, and the most coordinated hunters, at least in the genus Canis, if not among all canids. They have broad snouts, round ears, relatively short bodies with longish legs and tails. They're often gray, but the reality is that their coat color can vary greatly. They have big heads and large bone-crushing teeth and jaws. Not as specialized as those of bone-crushing hyenas or the ancient bone-crushing dogs, but starting to develop along those lines. They are excellent hunters that frequently hunt large ungulates, including moose. But they will happily hunt other prey as well and even scavenge. And it is a virtual guarantee that they have eaten many a grandmother and little pig, though their ability to blow houses down appears to have been greatly exaggerated in fiction. It isn't surprising that they're a popular villain in human literature, as this is likely the most dangerous predator of humans in much of Eurasia and North America. But not the only wolf in North America. In fact, there is a whole other clade of them. 3 other species. And possibly the best known of the 3, at least if you're not a basketball fan, is the most distantly related member of the clade, the coyote. Also known, and possibly reasonably, as the American jackal, the prairie wolf, or the brush wolf. And honestly, I have no problem with any of that. I decided that this whole African lineage of wolf-like canids were jackals a long time ago. And I certainly have no issue calling them wolves. I'd be mad if you didn't. So let's talk about these prairie wolves. They are the smallest of these 3 species of exclusively North American wolves, usually weighing between 7 and 20 kilos, 15 to 44 pounds, with males being larger, as is typical of Canis. And of course, they're smaller than gray wolves, as no canids are larger as a species. But they do have a fairly similar basic appearance to small gray wolves. That coloration is often very similar. But their body is longer, their legs a bit shorter, their muzzle narrower, and their ears more pointed. They're mostly carnivorous and feed primarily on smaller animals, sometimes even teaming up with close relatives like badgers to catch them more efficiently. Their two closest relatives are the last two species in the genus Canis and the last two members of the jackals, the extant wolf-like canids. Those would be the red wolf of the southeastern United States and the eastern wolf, also called the timber wolf of southeastern Canada. Red wolves are larger than coyotes, but smaller than gray wolves at 20 to 39 kilos, roughly 44 to 85 pounds, with males being larger than females. With timber wolves being about the same size despite living in very different climates. Red wolves are not all that red, but they definitely have more red on them than coyotes or gray wolves, though some are melanistic. They also have larger ears and are more sociable than coyotes, so they're more likely to be seen in small groups. They're overall lightly built with long, thin legs for moving quickly, almost like a wolf-greyhound cross. Eastern wolves honestly look very similar to red wolves, but in a clearly different part of the continent and with smaller ears. Remember, large ears are usually associated with hot climates. So in many ways, these look even more like coyotes, but are again more social and are more likely to be seen in small packs. These are both omnivores, but they both prey on smaller ungulates and often smaller mammals and other animals. And that gets us to the end of the jackals. So far, we know that not all foxes are foxes, all wolves are jackals, and not all dogs have bones. But there is one more clade, a big one, and possibly the weirdest one, as it is pretty much South America's answer to all of the canids found in the rest of the world, plus some things that are unlike anything we have in the rest of the world. And just like this clade has convinced me that all of the extant wolf-like canids are jackals, this final clade has me wondering if all of the extant canids are, in fact, foxes. I mean, it contains this thing. And that is one of the few members of this clade not generally called a fox. Of the 10 species, at least 8 of them are commonly referred to as foxes. And unless that name is totally undeserved, it might mean that all foxes are foxes. At the very least, I feel pretty confident telling you that just like the common ancestor of all feliforms likely look like a civet, the common ancestor of all extant canids probably looked like a fox. Because the species in this final clade of mostly foxes are more closely related to wolves and domestic dogs than they are to red foxes. And all living canid species, except for one, are more closely related to one another than any of them are to gray foxes. That fox body plan just keeps popping up. And either it's happening over and over and over again in pretty much every major canid clade, or this is the ancestral form, and a few groups have diverged from it here and there. But true foxes or not, this last clade of canids might be the raddest of all. Because so far, we have been discussing all of the canids of the world, except for South America. Gray foxes may start to touch the continent, but for most of South America, there isn't a single canid species, other than the members of this clade, that are found in South America and nowhere else. This is South America's answer to the canids of the world. Some look very familiar, and some are totally unique and bizarre, but at least they all have bones. Let's start with the most famous member of the clade. An animal called a wolf that looks more like a red fox, but isn't. And despite its resemblance to a red fox, the foxiest of the foxes, is one of the few members of the clade that isn't normally called a fox. The maned wolf, which is one of the 2 extant members of the basalmost clade of the Cyrtocyanina. A couple of hundred years ago, you could have seen a third species, their closest at the time living relatives, the Falkland Islands wolf, the only land mammal native to the Falkland Islands, which was one of the coolest animals ever and was sadly driven to extinction in the late 1800s. It was basically the dodo bird of foxes. assuming that they are foxes. Darwin described them as a large wolf-like fox. So Darwin was down with our all foxes are foxes hypothesis. But being the only large predators on the islands, they basically had no fear of humans and would walk right up to people as they had no selective reason to fear anything. And so they were curious without any reason for fear. Unfortunately, humans are some of the most dangerous animals you can possibly approach. They'll kill you for all sorts of reasons. And these awesome canids had sadly never encountered anything like that before. So there are only 2 species in this clade alive today. The maned wolf of East Central South America and the bush dog of Northern South America. And actually even a touch into Central America. I mean, if the gray foxes can dabble in South America, the Cerdocyanina has got to have somebody peeking into Central America. And that would be the bush dog. So far we have a wolf that isn't a wolf and a dog that isn't a dog. Being the outgroup of the South American canids, they are the 2 most unusual members of the Cerdocyanina. And they're both some of the most unusual canids, period, in my assessment. Maned wolves, while not wolves, are the largest canids in South America, weighing between 20 and 30 kilos, like 44 to 66 pounds. But it really isn't their weight that is so outstanding about them. It's their height. They stand around 110 centimeters, about 43 inches at the shoulder. That's about 10 inches taller than a gray wolf. Even about 5 inches taller than a dire wolf. The first time I ever saw them in person, it was at the Denver Zoo where they had a sign that read, "A fox on stilts?" To which Darwin would say, "Yeah, not a red fox. Gray foxes and island foxes are the only living canids more distantly related to red foxes than are these stilt foxes. But if red foxes and anything else that we discussed today are foxes, then so are these. Just weird, large, super tall giraffe foxes. I know that giraffes are notorious for their long necks, but compared to their legs, giraffes have disproportionately short necks. And so do these. But why are they like that? A very good question indeed. And the answer seems to be mainly that they live in tall grasslands, and being so stilty helps them move through the grass and see and hear over it. They're predators, mostly of prey much smaller than they are. Being solitary hunters, they would have a hard time taking down the large prey of many of the pack-hunting larger canids. But most of their diet is composed of plant matter, with the largest share being made up of a single fruit called a wolf apple, named for the maned wolf, not for actual wolves. So they're omnivores, eating animal prey mostly in the dry season. As for the mane, it's black and erectile. It can be stood up to make the stilt fox look even bigger and taller than it actually is, at times when that might be beneficial. A really weird canid to be sure. And though differently weird, it might not be any weirder than its closest living relative, now that the Falkland Island wolf is extinct. The bush dog, also often called the vinegar dog or vinegar fox for reasons that will probably become obvious. Though it is one of the strangest looking wild dogs I have seen. It almost looks like a mix between a Tasmanian devil and a hyrax. Don't try to tell me that you don't see the hyrax in there. If you showed me a vinegar fox and told me that it was a more carnivorous species of hyrax, I probably would have believed you. I mean, they look way more like a hyrax than does a manatee. And yet, if you have seen our complete tour of the mammals, you already know which one is actually closer to the hyrax. Anyway, this is a crazy looking fox. And while their closest relatives are the tallest of all wild canids, these guys are short and squat. They weigh between 5 and 8 kilos, 11 to 18 pounds, but they stand only 8 to 12 inches tall. That's 20 to 30 centimeters. They're about the size of a dachshund. Slightly taller and lighter, but it'll give you a good idea. They tend to be dark on the belly and lighter on top, with small ears and a stubby tail. Unlike their tall, crepuscular, solitary, highly omnivorous cousins, these guys are short, diurnal, highly social, and largely carnivorous. Hunting a variety of prey, but specializing in many of the large rodents that we discussed in this video. Many of which are semi-aquatic, like capybaras and pacas. And these squat little hyrax devil foxes are fully equipped with torpedo bodies and webbed feet to follow them where they swim. But what's with the vinegar? I reckon that if you had to guess, you'd probably get pretty close. But it is my understanding that their urine and scent glands have a strong and familiar aroma. You'd be a very lucky person if you ever see a bush dog, but maybe a bit less fortunate if all you ever get to do is walk by a tree they decided to claim. However, if you're ever walking through the jungle in South America and you come across the distinct smell of vinegar, you might be in the territory of one of the coolest canids in the world. And that gets us out of this weirdest clade, and possibly the weirdest clade of dogs with bones on the planet. But don't worry, we're not out of the weird possible foxes, because more are coming right away. The hagfish of the final canid clade, the species most distantly related to the other 7, is this. The short-eared dog, also known as the short or small-eared fox of northwestern South America. These were absolutely where we were in the Peruvian Amazon, but we never saw one. The fact is that researchers will spend their entire careers in the Amazon rainforest without ever seeing one. They are extremely elusive. And it looked like the result of what might happen if a taxidermist was supposed to taxidermy a jaguarundi, but they were out of jaguarundi forms, so they used one that was meant for a smallish beagle and gave it a foxtail. They're about 35 centimeters tall, just under 14 inches at the shoulder, and weigh about 9 kilos, or around 20 pounds. Like beagles. But those ears and coloration clearly come from the jaguarundi. And the tail, again, is from a fox. Their paws are partially webbed, which is good because while they hunt all sorts of things, fish of the water variety make up the biggest part of their diets, followed by things like insects and fish of the small mammal variety. Though plants, crabs, and fish of other tetrapod varieties also make up a significant part of the diet as well. They look a little like bush dogs, but that big tail should be a pretty clear thing that you could use to know which swimming South American weird fox called a dog you're looking at. And they don't smell like vinegar. Their closest relatives are not bush dogs, but rather the rest of the South American foxes that we're yet to discuss. And of the remaining 7 foxes, the fox most distantly related to the other 6, after the short-eared fox, is the crab-eating fox of North and Eastern South America, which eat crabs, and might be foxes. Honestly, it appears that crab-eating foxes and short-eared foxes got together and said, hey, we're both going to eat crabs in the warmer parts of South America. Short-eared foxes, where do you want to be? Oh, okay, we'll be everywhere else. But despite enjoying a diet that includes crustaceans and being somewhat similar in color, you probably shouldn't have too much trouble telling the two apart, without even knowing where in South America you are. Crab-eating foxes seem to weigh a bit less than short-eared foxes, 4.5 to 7.7 kilos, or about 10 to 17 pounds. But they're about the same height, standing between 30 and 40 centimeters tall, 12 to 16 inches. Though I've seen a lot of different reports with many seemingly conflating the length without including the tail as the height. So you might see different numbers. A similar height, but a more lean-built fox than the short-eared fox, with larger, pointier ears and a thinner face more like that of the maned wolf. They tend to be grayish-brown, but bits of red, yellow, and black seem to poke through all over. Much of the dorsal part of crab-eating foxes appears to be highly black, and some even look like they have a little mane. Overall, they look much more like tiny gray-maned wolves than they do like jaguarundi-wrapped beagles. And calling this a fox is not much of a stretch. They do eat crabs, lots of crabs, but also insects and small mammals as well as plants. Like most foxes, they're omnivores. The remaining 6 species, the closest relatives of the crab-eating foxes, all fall into the same genus, Lycolopes, often called the South American foxes. Though again, there is a very good argument that this entire clade that we have been discussing are South American foxes. But these are some really fox-like potential foxes. These are basically the South American fox equivalent of vulpes in the rest of the world. Vulpes are the definitely foxes, though perhaps not the only foxes. And Lycolopes are the definitely South American foxes, though perhaps not the only South American foxes. Look, I didn't name them. And the reality is that the people that did had no idea how all of the things that they call foxes are related. They didn't know. They just called all of the little canids foxes. The problem is that all of the things that really look like foxes aren't all one another's closest relatives. But when we call them all foxes, most people get the idea that they are all closely related to one another. It reinforces a misconception, leaving us with a few paths that we can take. We can either continue to reinforce this misconception by using these names in a paraphyletic manner. We can try to throw out these terms and replace them with new terms. Or we can teach people that for these terms to accurately reflect our current understanding of evolutionary relationships, we need to recognize a few groups that were historically excluded from the groups that need to be included. For example, like birds or reptiles, snakes or lizards, or wolves or foxes. Now, it is true that most clades have names, so we could try to convince the public to forget the word fox, other than for the genus Vulpes, and then memorize a long list of new and often abstract names. But if you ask me, it is much easier to simply let people know that all extant canids are foxes. Some foxes are also jackals, and some jackals are also wolves. Clean and simple. You might disagree, but I'm glad that there seems to be a pretty widespread consensus on this in biology as a whole. Again, they also have scientific names, but that doesn't mean that we can't use common names as well. And yes, saying that wolves are big foxes might raise a few eyebrows, but is that really a conversation you wouldn't enjoy having? I do. Which is why I just ordered my own Birds or Reptiles hoodie from our merch store. You could have one too. But let's talk about the most fox-like of all South American foxes, the genus Lycolopex. And man, do they look like foxes. Because they are. They just are more closely related to wolves and penis tumors than they are to red foxes. These guys have really dominated pretty much all of South America, except for the Amazon rainforest, with most in southern South America and the west coast west of the Andes. The only real exception being the outgroup to the genus, the hoary fox of southern Brazil. These guys are pretty small, 3 to 4 kilos. It's like 6.6 to 8.8 pounds. They're nocturnal and solitary and feed largely on insects, but also rodents, birds, and fruit. They're gray or reddish on top with a lighter, often cream-colored belly and a black tail stripe like a gray fox. And while they could be confused with some of their closest relatives, their distinct range should help you know easily which one you have. The next most distantly related species to the other 4 in the genus comes from a very different part of South America, the Secharan Desert of northwestern Peru and southwestern Ecuador. This fox, called the Secharan fox or Peruvian desert fox, is also small, 2.6 to 4.2 kilos. That's like 5.7 to 9.3 pounds. And to me, they look like little jackals painted up like coyotes. They're mostly agouti colored, which is like gray but made up of a fine blend of hair of different colors and not a single uniform color, with a cream-colored belly, chest, and chin, with a gray band across the chest. For the most part, they lack the reds seen on most of the genus, but they do have red on their ears, around their eyes, and on their legs. Like the hoary fox, they feed largely on insects and plants. The remaining 4 species are all more closely related to one another than they are to any other animals alive today, and they fall into 2 clades, each containing 2 species. Now, all 4 of these foxes are pretty similar to one another, but there is one that I think is the coolest of the 4, so I'm going to save that one for last. I'll start with the clade that doesn't include it. That said, this clade does include 2 stinking rad little foxes, the Andean fox and the South American gray fox, which is not closely related to gray foxes at all. Gray foxes are among its most distant extant canid relatives. The Andean fox, also called a culpeo, has a giant range, the whole Andes Mountains, the whole way from Colombia in the north to the southern tips of Chile and Argentina, as well as the Sierras Grandes in Argentina. A giant mountain range. I don't recall seeing a fox during the 15 months that I lived in the Andes, but if I had seen one, this probably would have been it. And I probably would remember seeing one. This is the 2nd largest canid native to South America, weighing 5 to 13.5 kilos or 11 to 30 pounds. And I certainly did see a lot of the things that they eat. These guys eat a lot less plant material than do most of their cousins. They're primarily carnivores that feed on things like guanacos, flamingos, rodents like degus, vicuñas, lagomorphs, as well as insects, lizards, and birds. And if you're not familiar with vicuñas and guanacos, they are the wild closest relatives of llamas and alpacas. And interestingly, culpeos too were domesticated. They were domesticated by the Selknam people, creating a domesticated breed known as the Fuegian dog, which is now unfortunately extinct. They have overall a very jackal-like appearance. They have a salt and pepper back with a reddish head and legs. Their tails are fluffy with a dark tip and are often white on their chins and chest. They're honestly super beautiful and really cool. Their closest relatives are the South American gray foxes, which are only arguably foxes, and again, they don't have a living canid relative more distant than our gray foxes. These guys are found in southern and western South America, pretty much everywhere that touches the Andes Mountains, but isn't in the Andes Mountains. So you can tell if you're looking at an Andean fox or a South American gray fox by looking at your altimeter. You can also tell because most of the time they're much smaller, 2.5 to less than 5.5 kilos, like 5.5 to 12 pounds. So there are South American gray foxes larger than the smallest Andean foxes, but overall they're much smaller. Their coloration is very similar to that of their high-altitude giant cousins, but they do tend to have black on their chins, which can further be used to distinguish between the two. And they eat a pretty similar diet, just with smaller prey items and more fruit, since fruit is more common when you're not in the Andes. And that brings us to the two final species of canids alive today, the pampas fox and the Darwin's fox. The pampas fox has by far the larger range of the two, occupying most of southern South America except for the southernmost regions and stopping at the eastern edge of the Andes Mountains, which is the best way to tell it apart from the Andean fox, as it does look very similar. They have very similar coloration, and while they're smaller than Andean foxes on average at 2.4 to 8 kilos, which is like 5.3 to almost 18 pounds, the largest pampas foxes are much larger than the smallest Andean foxes. They do tend to have a black spot on the muzzle, in case you're ever in a situation of having to tell the difference between a pampas fox and an Andean fox, and you don't know which part of South America you're in, and it is between 5 and 8 kilos in size. But they look very similar to one another despite living in different places and not being one another's closest relatives. They're also much more omnivorous, eating pretty much all of the kinds of things that you would expect a South American fox to eat, given that you know about every species at this point, except for one. So what is this coolest member of the Lycolopex? Well, it's the Darwin's fox. And just to manage expectations, while I think this is the coolest member of the genus, it is still similar to the other members of the genus in most ways, though it is probably the easiest to identify due to their very dark coloration. They aren't the biggest members of the genus, coming in at 1.8 to just under 4 kilos, 4 to almost 9 pounds, but they are the rarest. The first one of these dark little foxes to be collected by the Western scientific community was collected on San Pedro Island off the coast of Chile by some dude named Charles Darwin in 1834 while he was sailing around on some boat named after another dog, a smellhound of some sort. I don't think it was a bloodhound or a basset. A beagle, I think. Maybe you've heard of it. So this was like a 19th century South American rendition of the Fox and the Hound. Except where the fox is arguably not a fox, the hound is a boat, and the hunter hunts with a geological hammer. But that's why it's called Darwin's fox. They were long thought to be an endemic island population until they were discovered in the mainland as well in the 1990s, in Chile's forested Nahuelbuta National Park. Darwin's foxes seem to prefer heavily forested habitats, which probably has a lot to do with why they were not noticed for so long. As with most foxes, it's an omnivore that mostly eats small mammals and fruits. During the last glacial maximum, the Chiloé archipelago, where San Pedro Island is located, was connected to the mainland by a land bridge. This is how the foxes got to the islands, which weren't islands until the melting of the glaciers elevated the sea level about 15,000 years ago. And since that time, the two populations have been isolated from one another. The crazy thing is that there are only a few hundred Darwin's foxes on the planet, most in the Chiloé archipelago, and only a few dozen in the Nahuelbuta National Park. So while they might be the coolest members of the genus, they certainly aren't the most numerous. But that completes our tour of the canids. All of them. So, are all foxes foxes? As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. I just want to say a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon who have made this incredible project possible. Obviously, we have a lot of really cool features for our patrons, but more than anything, I just appreciate the way that you guys stand behind us and allow us to create projects that would be otherwise unimaginable. So thank you.